On a July evening in 2023, four friends from out of state stepped off a pullout on the Seward Highway and walked out onto what looked like a beach. It wasn't one. Within a few hundred feet, the sand turned to a smooth gray silt, the kind that photographs well and gives way underfoot like nothing they'd stood on before. One of them, 20 years old, sank to his waist and stopped moving. His friends couldn't pull him free. Firefighters arrived, then more firefighters, then a specialized team with a tool built for exactly this kind of ground. None of it was fast enough. The tide that fills Turnagain Arm twice a day was already coming back in, and it doesn't wait for a rescue to finish. That single choice, to walk 20 feet past a warning sign onto ground that looks solid, is the hinge this whole story turns on. Alaska doesn't advertise its worst places with cliffs and warning colors. Most of the 20 locations ahead look ordinary from the pullout, the runway, or the harbor. A gray flat at low tide, a gap in the trees the map calls a pass, a patch of river ice that held yesterday. Each one hides a threshold, a line a person can walk toward without any sense that the ground rules are about to change. And each threshold in Alaska changes the rules in a different way. This isn't a single kind of danger repeated 20 times with a different backdrop. It's 20 different boundaries, crossed by people who had specific, often reasonable reasons for crossing them. And the goal here is to understand exactly where each line sits and why the people who live closest to it keep choosing to stand near it anyway. Start where that decision happened, because the mechanics of Cook Inlet silt explain more about Alaska than they first appear to. Turnagain Arm carries some of the largest tidal range in North America, water rising and falling by close to 40 feet across a single cycle in the upper reaches near Anchorage. Glaciers upstream have spent thousands of years grinding rock into a flour-fine sediment, and the tide deposits that sediment across the arm's flats in layers so saturated with water that they behave less like mud and more like a substance engineers call thixotropic, solid enough to bear weight while it's undisturbed, and liquid the instant a foot presses down and shifts it. A boot breaks the surface tension holding the grains together, water rushes in around it, and the silt closes over the foot like wet concrete setting in reverse. Firefighters who work these calls carry a tool that looks almost absurd for the job. A hose fitted with a lance that pumps pressurized water straight down around a trapped leg, breaking the suction from below rather than trying to pull against it from above. When it works in minutes. When the person is in past both legs, or the tide has already turned, minutes are the one thing nobody has left. At least 3 people have drowned on these flats in documented incidents, pinned by the silt as the incoming water rose past their shoulders, unable to free themselves even with rescuers standing an arm's length away. What makes Turnagain Arm worth opening on isn't the drowning itself. It's the shape of the trap. A hazard invisible until the exact second a person's weight tests it, on ground 100 yards from a state highway, in a place most visitors reach without a permit, a guide, or any sense that they've crossed into anything at all. Strangely, the same tidal mechanics that make the mudflats lethal also produce one of the more unusual recreational features in North America. Turnagain Arm's extreme tidal range generates a genuine bore tide, a wall of incoming water that can rise several feet and surge up the inlet as a single traveling wave rather than a gradual rise. One of only a small number of reliably surfable tidal bores on the continent. Surfers and paddleboarders do ride it, timing their sessions to the tide tables with a precision that looks almost paradoxical, set against the drownings a few hundred yards away on the flats. The two facts aren't in tension. They're the same physical mechanism, an enormous volume of water moving through a narrowing channel on a strict lunar schedule. And whether it becomes a recreational feature or a fatal trap depends entirely on whether the person meeting it is riding on top of the water or standing in the silt underneath it. The state's response to the mudflat trap specifically has itself become a small case study in how a community adapts to a threshold that can't simply be fenced off. Anchorage Fire Department crews train specifically for mudflat rescue, a skill set almost no other department in the country needs. And the equipment they've developed, that pressurized water lance, along with wide backboards that spread a rescuer's weight enough to approach a stuck person without becoming stuck alongside them, exists because generic swift water or wilderness rescue gear simply doesn't address a hazard this specific. Crews describe the training itself as counterintuitive in a way few other rescue disciplines are, since the instinct to pull hard against a trapped limb is exactly the instinct that has to be suppressed, replaced instead with the slower, more patient work of breaking the silt's suction from underneath rather than fighting it from above. Signs along the pullouts warn visitors in blunt language rather than the softened phrasing used for most park hazards, because softer wording, tourism officials eventually concluded, wasn't stopping people from walking out anyway. The mudflats haven't gotten any less dangerous. What's changed is that the agencies responsible for the coastline stopped treating the danger as freakish and started treating it as a known, recurring feature of the terrain, worth building a dedicated response around, rather than hoping visitors read the sign closely enough. That's the first threshold. The next one required a different kind of unawareness, and it happened not to visitors, but to people who thought they understood exactly what they were walking into. In the spring of 1898, tens of thousands of prospectors were funneling north through the Alaska Panhandle toward a route called the Chilkoot Trail, the shortest overland path from the coast to the goldfields of the Yukon. The trail climbed through a narrow pass above the tree line, a stretch locals called the Scales, where the grade steepened enough that packers charged stampeders by the pound just to haul their gear the final leg. Weeks of heavy snowfall that winter had built an unstable pack on the slopes above the trail, and by early April, warm winds were loosening it further. Tlingit guides working the route told the stampeders plainly that spring was the dangerous season in that country, that the snow above the pass didn't hold the way it had all winter. Most of the men pushing north didn't listen, because listening meant waiting, and waiting meant someone else reached the claims first. On the morning of April 3rd, a Sunday, snow slid down onto the trail near the Scales in a series of slope failures. 5 in total, 3 of them burying people. The first killed 3 men outright. A second slide caught the work crew of the local tram company as they tried to evacuate stampeders from a stretch of trail they judged too dangerous to leave standing, killing the crew along with the people they were trying to move. A third slide, in almost the same spot, buried roughly 70 more people who had been following the packed-down path the tram crew's own footsteps had left in the snow. A path that looked safer for having already been walked. Rescue parties, made up largely of fellow stampeders who dropped their own gear to dig, worked through the debris for days in temperatures that made the recovery itself dangerous. The final count of the dead from that single Palm Sunday reached somewhere close to 65, making it the deadliest event of the entire Klondike Gold Rush. Worse than any single mining accident, any shipwreck on the Inside Passage, any of the diseases that killed stampeders by the dozen in the tent camps below. The mechanism here is worth sitting with, because it recurs across the rest of this list in different clothing. It wasn't ignorance of the danger that killed the people on the Scales. Warnings existed, delivered by people with generations of local knowledge, and they went unheeded because the economic pressure to keep moving outweighed a hazard nobody could see building over their heads. A slope holds until it doesn't, and the moment it releases gives almost no warning to the people standing on the trail below. That's a second kind of threshold, different from Turnagain Arm's invisible mud. Not a line a single careless step crosses, but a slowly loading structural failure that 100 people can walk beneath safely, until the 101st crossing coincides with the exact conditions that let the slope go. 60 miles northwest along the same stretch of coastline, a third kind of threshold sits inside a fjord so narrow It barely shows up at the scale of a state map. Lituya Bay cuts 7 miles into the Fairweather Range, a T-shaped inlet with steep granite walls rising almost straight out of the water on both sides. On the night of July 9, 1958, an earthquake, measuring somewhere around magnitude 8, ruptured along the Fairweather Fault, which runs directly beneath the bay's northeast shore. The shaking dislodged something like 40 million cubic yards of rock, an entire mountainside, and sent it falling nearly 3,000 feet into the water of Gilbert Inlet at the bay's head. What happened next has no real precedent in the recorded history of tsunamis anywhere on Earth. The impact displaced water with enough force to send a wave surging up the opposite slope to a height of 1,720 feet, roughly the height of 1.5 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other, stripping every tree and every inch of soil from the mountainside up to that line as cleanly as a razor. 3 fishing boats were anchored in the bay that night. 2 of them rode the wave out to open water, battered but afloat, their crews describing being lifted over a spit of land that should have been impossible to clear. The 3rd boat and its 2 occupants were never seen again. The scar the wave left on the mountainside, a pale band of exposed rock hundreds of feet above the waterline, is still visible today, a permanent measurement of a single night's violence carved directly into the landscape. Lituya Bay's threshold is the strangest of the 3 so far, and geology, not the water itself, is really what's driving it, operating on a timescale that has nothing to do with a human visit. The bay looked, on the evening of July 9th, exactly the way it had looked for years, sheltered, deep, ringed by mountains that made it feel like the safest anchorage on that stretch of coast. The line being crossed wasn't visible on the surface. It was building along a fault plane beneath the seafloor. On a schedule no one anchored in the bay that night had any way to read. The 1958 event wasn't even the first of its kind here, which is part of what makes the bay worth understanding rather than simply marveling at. Geologists studying the surrounding slopes have identified trim lines, the same kind of stripped, regrown vegetation boundary left by the 1958 wave, from at least 3 earlier giant waves generated in the bay over the preceding century, including large events in 1936 and 1899. Lituya Bay is a fjord, sitting directly on an active fault, structurally primed to repeat this exact mechanism whenever the next rupture dislodges enough rock into the water at the right angle, rather than a place that simply happened to produce one freak disaster. And the local Tlingit oral tradition attached to the bay's name carries warnings about exactly this kind of danger that predate any written seismic record by generations. Fishing boats still anchor here today, drawn by the same sheltered appearance that made it look safe in 1958, and the same fault line still runs directly beneath them. Move inland from the coast, and the threshold stops being about what's underfoot, and starts being about what's overhead, in the form of altitude and the specific way a mountain in this latitude punishes a body for climbing it. The mountain's own name carries a small piece of this story worth pausing on. Koyukon Athabascan people had called the peak Denali, meaning something close to the Tall One or the Great One, for generations before a gold prospector renamed it after a presidential candidate in 1896, a name that stuck officially for well over a century despite the mountain never having any connection to the man it was named for. Alaska's state government formally reverted to Denali in the 1970s, and the federal government followed decades later, restoring a name that had described the mountain accurately in the language of the people who lived closest to it, long before any outside expedition ever attempted its summit. Denali rises to just over 20,000 feet, which by itself doesn't sound like the tallest mountain in the world, and it isn't. What makes it behave like one is where it sits. Everest's summit is closer to sea level in barometric terms than a climber might expect, because the atmosphere bulges at the equator and thins faster at high latitude. Denali sits far enough north that the air at its summit carries roughly the same effective oxygen pressure as a peak several thousand feet higher near the equator. A climber's body doesn't know the difference between an actual 26,000-foot summit and Denali's altitude-latitude equivalent of 1. It just starts failing the same way, with the same narrowing window between functioning and not. In June of 1967, a 12-man team formed from 2 expeditions that had merged on the mountain, 9 men originally led by 24-year-old Joe Wilcox and 3 more from a smaller Colorado group, reached the summit and started down into what the National Weather Service would later reconstruct as one of the most violent storms ever measured on the peak. Wind gusts eventually modeled above 200 miles an hour, temperatures near 30 below before the wind chill was even factored in. 7 of the 12 never made it off the mountain. Jerry Clark, Steve Taylor, Dennis Luchterhand, Mark McLaughlin, Hank Janes, John Russell, and Walt Taylor died somewhere on the upper slopes, pinned in place by wind that made walking impossible and shelter nearly so. Search parties combed the upper mountain for weeks, once conditions allowed, and only 3 of their bodies were ever recovered, the rest presumably still somewhere on the mountain's upper slopes, buried under decades of subsequent snowfall. It remains the deadliest single incident in the mountain's climbing history, and the reason it happened isn't a mystery the way Lituya Bay's timing was a mystery. Storms of that violence are a known, recurring feature of Denali's upper mountain, generated when the polar jet stream compresses against the peak's height and latitude, and climbers who reach the summit ridge are, by definition, standing in the one place on the route with no fast way down if that jet stream decides to lower itself onto the mountain while they're up there. That's the specific shape of Denali's threshold, not a line a climber crosses once, but a zone, roughly above 17,000 feet where the return trip stops being optional in the way it is lower down. Below that line, a climber who feels the early symptoms of altitude sickness, the headache, the nausea, the strange dulling of decision-making that low oxygen produces, can turn around and descend to easier air within an hour or 2. Above it, on the traverse across the football field or through Denali Pass, turning around still means hours of exposed climbing in the same thin air causing the problem, at the exact moment a climber's judgment is most compromised by that same thin air. More than 130 climbers have died on the mountain since the National Park Service started keeping records in the early 1930s. An average that, spread across roughly 9 decades of climbing history, still understates how concentrated the risk actually is, since the vast majority of those deaths cluster in a handful of specific storm years and specific stretches of route, rather than distributing evenly across every season anyone has attempted the summit. The 2 leading causes aren't exotic. They're falls, most of them on the West Buttress route that carries the overwhelming majority of the mountain's traffic, and exposure, the slow mechanical failure of a body that ran out of the reserves needed to survive a forecast that changed faster than the climbers coming down from the summit could react to it. Rangers stationed at the 14,200-foot camp each climbing season run one of the more unusual outposts in the park system, monitoring radio forecasts, tracking which teams are moving where on the upper mountain, and coordinating helicopter response in a landscape where a rescue helicopter itself can't always fly. Because the same wind that's killing a climber on the ridge is often too violent for a llama or Chinook to approach safely. Gear has improved over decades of dying here, but the adaptation that actually matters is something else entirely. A specific, hard-won respect for turnaround times set before the climb starts. A discipline that treats the summit as optional and the descent as the only mandatory part of the trip, because the mountain has demonstrated, repeatedly and by name, exactly what happens to teams who reverse that priority. The Park Service has built its own layer of adaptation directly into the permit system. Every climber attempting Denali has to register at least 60 days before their expedition, a window intended to give rangers a running count of how many teams are on the mountain at once, and roughly where, so that a sudden storm doesn't leave dispatchers guessing how many parties are exposed above 17,000 feet. Climbers are required to pack out human waste using a system of designated containers rather than leaving it in the snow, a rule with genuine practical teeth, given how many decades of expeditions have compressed onto the same handful of established routes. None of it prevents a storm like the one that hit the Wilcox team in 1967. It does mean that when a storm of that scale builds now, the mountains rangers generally know within hours, not days, exactly how many people are in its path. And that single piece of information has changed how fast a rescue response can begin once conditions allow one at all. North and east of Denali, across a swath of country most Americans have never had reason to look at on a map, sits the largest national park in the United States. A park so big that Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Switzerland could all fit inside its boundary with room left over. Wrangell St. Elias holds 4 mountain ranges and some of the largest non-polar ice fields on the planet. Glaciers with names like the Nabesna and the Kennecott, sprawling for dozens of miles across terrain that has almost no permanent human presence inside it at all. The threshold here doesn't announce itself with a storm or a wave. It's structural, and it's hidden directly beneath a hiker's boots. Glaciers move, and as they move over uneven bedrock, the ice fractures into crevasses, deep vertical cracks that can run for hundreds of feet and drop far enough that a fall into one is rarely survivable without immediate specialized rescue. Depth alone doesn't make crevasses lethal. What does is the way snow bridges form across their openings. Thin arches of packed snow that look, from above, exactly like solid ground, sometimes supporting the first climber on a rope team and giving way under the second or third. A person walking alone across a glacier that appears flat and unbroken for as far as they can see may be walking across a lattice of these hidden gaps, each one bridged just well enough to hide the danger until a boot finds the weak point. Search and rescue teams in Wrangell St. Elias, when they respond at all, are often responding hours or days after the fact, because the nearest road access to much of the park's interior is measured in dozens of miles of trackless ice and rock, reachable only by small aircraft landing on unmarked glacier strips, weather permitting. Weather in the Wrangells frequently doesn't permit anything for days at a stretch. What draws people onto that ice anyway is the same thing that has drawn people to remote country everywhere: the promise of a landscape nobody else is standing on. Mountaineers come for peaks that see a handful of attempts in a good year. Backcountry skiers come for descents that exist on no marked trail. The people who work in the park, guides and rangers who've spent seasons learning which glaciers behave predictably and which don't, describe the terrain less as dangerous in a constant sense and more as unforgiving of a single specific mistake. The mistake of trusting a surface that hasn't been tested, roped travel, crevasse rescue training, and probing ahead of every step across suspect terrain aren't formalities out here. They're the entire difference between a safe crossing and a rescue that may not arrive before hypothermia does the rest of the work gravity started. Access to most of Wrangell St. Elias depends entirely on a small community of bush pilots operating out of towns like McCarthy and Chitina, flying small fixed-wing aircraft onto unmarked glacier strips and gravel bars that would register as nothing more than an irregular patch of white or gray from any altitude above a few hundred feet. These pilots function, in practice, as the park's real infrastructure, since there's no other reliable way to reach most of its interior. And the skill involved goes well beyond ordinary flying, reading a glacier's surface from the air to judge whether the snow covering a landing strip is firm enough to support the aircraft's weight, tracking which strips have been reshaped by a recent storm or shifted by the ice moving underneath them, and making the final call on whether a specific landing is safe on that day in that light. With that particular aircraft's load, a judgment call repeated dozens of times each season with no formal air traffic control anywhere nearby to double-check it. A pilot who reads the glacier wrong risks the same buried crevasse danger the climbers on the ground are managing. Just approached from 3 feet off the surface at landing speed instead of on foot. The old copper boomtown of Kennecott, abandoned inside what's now the park's boundary since the mine that built it closed in the 1930s, sits as a physical reminder that this remoteness cuts both ways. It once supported a working community entirely dependent on rail access through terrain considered, even then, some of the most difficult industrial ground in North America to operate in. And when the ore ran out, the company simply left, unwilling to keep maintaining infrastructure this expensive to sustain in country this isolated. The glaciers didn't get any friendlier once the miners left. They just went back to being crossed almost exclusively by people who chose the risk deliberately, rather than by a workforce that had no real alternative. Some thresholds in Alaska don't require a mountain, a wave, or a moving glacier at all. They require nothing but stillness and a specific arrangement of cold air that has nowhere to go. On the night of January 23, 1971, a thermometer at a pipeline construction camp called Prospect Creek, tucked into a river valley about 160 miles north of Fairbanks, recorded a temperature of 80 degrees below zero. It remains the coldest reading ever measured anywhere in the United States, colder than anything recorded in Antarctica's most extreme American research outposts, colder by a wide margin than anywhere in the lower 48 has ever come close to touching. What made Prospect Creek the site of that record wasn't bad luck. It was geography working exactly as physics predicts. Cold air is denser than warm air, and in a landscape of river valleys ringed by low hills, that dense air sinks and pools at the bottom, unable to mix with anything warmer above it because there's no wind in these conditions to stir the layers together. Meteorologists call it a temperature inversion, and interior Alaska is close to a perfect machine for producing one. Clear skies that let heat radiate straight out into space overnight, calm air that refuses to circulate, and valley floors shaped exactly like bowls for cold air to collect in, holding it there undisturbed for days at a time whenever a high-pressure system settles in overhead and simply refuses to move on. The mechanism matters because it explains why interior communities like Fairbanks treat 40 and 50 below, not as an emergency, but as a Tuesday, while the same temperature would paralyze almost anywhere else in the country. At those temperatures, exposed skin can develop frostbite in under 10 minutes, sometimes closer to 5 once wind is added to the equation, and the injury doesn't announce itself the way a burn does. Frostbitten skin often goes numb before it goes visibly damaged, meaning the person experiencing it may not notice anything is wrong until the tissue underneath has already started to freeze, a delay that has cost interior Alaskans fingers, toes, ears, and in the most severe documented cases, entire limbs. Vehicles themselves fail differently at these temperatures than almost anywhere else drivers commonly operate them. Diesel fuel can gel into a thick, waxy consistency that clogs fuel lines entirely. If it isn't blended with an anti-gel additive for the season, batteries lose a substantial share of their effective capacity in extreme cold at precisely the moment an engine needs the most current to turn over. And tires develop flat spots overnight simply from sitting still in the cold, thumping audibly for the first mile of driving each morning until the rubber warms enough to round back out. None of these are exotic problems to residents. They're baseline maintenance facts, the interior equivalent of checking oil before a road trip, and the mechanics who keep vehicles running through an Alaskan interior winter build their entire seasonal business around exactly this list of failures. Because a car that runs fine everywhere else in the country will, without specific cold weather modification, simply stop working here. A vehicle that stalls on a rural road outside Fairbanks in January isn't an inconvenience. Depending on how far it is from the next occupied building, it can be a survival situation measured in tens of minutes rather than hours, which is why residents who've lived through more than one winter here build habits that look excessive anywhere else. engine block heaters plugged in overnight without exception, a full change of dry clothes kept in every vehicle, a policy of never letting the fuel tank drop below half in case a trip takes longer than planned. None of it is dramatic. All of it is what separates a routine cold snap from becoming a fatality. And interior hospitals see the failures every winter in the form of frostbite amputations and the occasional hypothermia death among people caught outside their vehicle, on foot, farther from shelter than they'd calculated. What's easy to miss about interior cold is that the threshold isn't the temperature itself. Humans have survived far colder for short exposures with the right gear. The threshold is the moment something ordinary breaks in extreme cold and turns a 5-minute walk into an hour-long one. A car that won't restart, a snow machine with a cracked belt 11 miles from the nearest cabin, a trail marker buried under fresh snowfall that leaves a hunter without a clear route back before dark. Cold this extreme doesn't kill through the temperature alone. It kills by removing the margin for anything else going wrong at the same time. And in a landscape this large, something eventually does. The same interior cold and unpredictable terrain define the roughly 1,000-mile trail that runs each March between Anchorage and Nome, the route of the annual Iditarod sled dog race, which crosses several of the exact hazards already described here: deep cold, river overflow, and stretches of coastal ice, compressed into a single, grueling event. Mushers running the trail face frostbite risk identical to any other traveler out in these temperatures, but the trail adds its own specific complications on top of the baseline cold. Overflow water seeping up through river ice along several crossings, capable of soaking a musher's boots and a dog team's paws at temperatures where wet gear turns dangerous within minutes, and long, exposed stretches, particularly along the Bering Sea coast near the finish, where a sudden ground blizzard can drop visibility to nothing and leave a musher and team navigating essentially blind between checkpoints that can be dozens of miles apart. Race organizers maintain a network of checkpoints and volunteer support specifically because a defined trail through this terrain, cleared and monitored by experienced local staff, converts an otherwise open, dangerous crossing of interior and coastal Alaska into something survivable for teams willing to prepare seriously for it, another version of the same pattern repeating, not eliminating the underlying cold and distance, but building enough structure and current information around it to make repeated crossings possible. Fairbanks itself develops a strange, localized side effect of these same inversions once temperatures drop much below about 40 below. Ice fog, a dense, sky-blotting haze formed when water vapor from car exhaust, home heating, and even human breath freezes instantly in air too cold to hold it as vapor, hanging motionless over the city, because the same still air that let the cold pool in the first place refuses to disperse it. Ice fog can cut visibility on the road to a few dozen feet and has grounded flights out of Fairbanks International Airport for days at a stretch, adding an aviation-specific version of the same underlying problem, still air-trapping something dangerous close to the ground that defines the temperature inversion itself. Longtime residents read a thickening ice fog the way people elsewhere read a dropping barometer, a clear signal that whatever plans required going outside are about to get considerably harder to complete. That same absence of margin defines the 414-mile gravel road that runs north from the town of Livengood, through the Brooks Range, Damburchda, Dorudburgshimk, and out onto the tundra of the North Slope, toward the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay. The Dalton Highway was built in the 1970s to service construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and it was never designed with a tourist or a casual driver in mind. For most of its length, there's no cell coverage, no guardrail on turns that drop away into river canyons, and only a handful of places to buy fuel, food, or a tire repair across the entire route. Most notably, a truck stop at Coldfoot that functions as the only real services between Fairbanks and the Arctic Ocean coast, a gap of well over 200 miles. Truckers who've hauled freight up this road for years describe it less as a highway and more as a commitment. Once a driver passes the last fuel stop heading north, turning back isn't meaningfully safer than continuing on, because either direction means hours of driving through terrain with no rescue infrastructure beyond what a driver is carrying in their own truck. Winter adds ice, whiteout conditions from ground blizzards that can drop visibility to nothing in seconds, even under a clear sky. And the Adagun Pass, a stretch through the Brooks Range, steep and exposed enough that it's closed outright during the worst storms, stranding traffic on whichever side happened to be driving when the closure came down. Summer adds a different hazard. Dust from unpaved sections thick enough to blind an oncoming driver at the exact moment two trucks meet on a road barely wide enough for both, and washouts from meltwater that can open a hole in the roadbed with no warning beyond a soft spot a driver feels a half second before the wheel drops into it. A wooden sign a little past the 200-mile mark, marking the point where the highway crosses the Arctic Circle, has turned into one of the road's few concessions to casual travelers, a spot where drivers who have no intention of continuing all the way to Deadhorse can still stop, take a photograph, and turn back toward Fairbanks, having crossed a real, if largely symbolic, threshold of latitude. State tourism officials treat the sign as a deliberate release valve, giving people curious about the Daltons' reputation a defined, manageable way to sample it without committing to the full run north, because the alternative, curious travelers pushing on toward Adagun Pass and Deadhorse without understanding what they were driving into, has produced enough underprepared breakdowns and near misses over the years that steering casual visitors toward a safer turnaround point has become its own quiet form of harm reduction. What keeps the Dalton running despite all of this is the same thing that keeps most of Alaska's dangerous places occupied. Something people need is on the other side. For decades, that meant pipeline maintenance and oil field supply runs. It increasingly also means tourism. Drivers chasing the specific appeal of driving to the edge of the Arctic Ocean on a road that still looks, from a satellite image, like a thin scratch across an otherwise empty landscape. The road hasn't gotten any less remote to accommodate them. State troopers who patrol the corridor, on the rare stretches where patrol is even practical, describe the same recurring failure in nearly every serious incident they respond to. A driver, often from outside Alaska, who underestimated how far apart help actually is out here, because nowhere else in the country trains a person to expect 400 miles with almost nothing on it. The stretch through Adagun Pass, where the highway crosses the Brooks Range at close to 5,000 feet, concentrates nearly every hazard the road carries into a single 8-mile climb. Steep grades that challenge loaded trucks even in good conditions, avalanche paths that state maintenance crews monitor and occasionally trigger deliberately with explosives to clear built-up snow before it can release onto traffic below, and a stretch of exposed roadway with essentially no shoulder to pull onto if a vehicle starts sliding. Truckers who've run the route for decades treat the pass the way Denali climbers treat the summit ridge, not as the hardest part of the job in a bragging sense, but as the specific few miles where the ordinary rules of driving stop applying and a different, more deliberate kind of attention takes over, for as long as the crossing lasts. Follow the Daltons' logic north far enough, and the ground itself starts changing seasons on a calendar nobody controls from an office. Past Fairbanks, in villages strung along the Yukon River like Circle, Eagle, and Fort Yukon, winter turns the river itself into the road. For months at a time, the Yukon freezes thick enough to carry snow machines, trucks, and in some stretches loaded freight, and communities that have no highway connection to the rest of the state depend on that ice for mail, groceries, fuel, and medical transport that would otherwise require an aircraft and a clear enough sky to fly one. The threshold here is temporal in a way none of the others quite are. The same river ice that's rated safe for a loaded pickup in February can be lethal in early November or late April, and the margin between those two states isn't marked by anything visible from the surface. Ice thickness varies across a single crossing depending on current speed underneath, depth, and where warmer groundwater seeps in from the banks, meaning a route that measured 2 feet of solid ice, 100 yards upstream, can thin to a few treacherous inches directly beneath the path a driver assumes is identical. Alaska's Department of Transportation and local villages both maintain informal networks, drivers radioing ahead about ice conditions, trail markers repositioned as safe routes shift week to week because the ice itself refuses to hold still long enough for a permanent map. Some communities along the river have gone further, marking and maintaining winter ice roads as a semi-official extension of the state's transportation system, complete with periodic thickness, testing at fixed points along the route, even though the underlying surface being tested and marked is structurally nothing more than frozen river water that will be open current again in 5 or 6 months. Overflow, water forced up through cracks in the ice by pressure from below and hidden under a thin skin of fresh snow, is the hazard locals fear most, since it looks from above identical to solid trail and soaks through boots, clothing, and machine parts in seconds at temperatures where wet fabric becomes its own kind of emergency almost immediately. What makes river ice travel here different from a hazard tourists occasionally stumble into is that residents don't have the option of avoiding it. A birth, a medical evacuation, or a funeral doesn't wait for a safer week. And villages that sit on the wrong side of a thinning river from the nearest clinic or airstrip have spent generations developing a working knowledge of ice that outperforms any single measurement, which bends in the river freeze thin because of current, which stretches near a bluff hold heat longer than open flats. Which years the freeze arrives late enough that the first crossings of the season carry real risk, no matter how careful the driver is. Search and rescue calls involving snow machines breaking through river ice happen most years in the villages along this stretch, and the survivors' accounts converge on the same detail again and again. The ice looked, sounded, and felt exactly like every other crossing right up until it didn't. Some villages have formalized that inherited knowledge into something closer to infrastructure. Local trail committees mark seasonal routes with spruce boughs or reflective stakes repositioned as ice conditions shift, test holes drilled at known trouble spots before a route is declared open for the season, and word of a thin stretch travels by radio and word of mouth faster than any official notice could move. None of it eliminates the risk. It converts an individual gamble, one driver guessing whether a crossing will hold, into a shared, continuously updated body of local intelligence, which is close to the only defense available in a landscape where the hazard itself refuses to sit still long enough for a permanent sign to mean anything for more than a few weeks at a time. North of the Brooks Range, Lakwain Erikitur Inarimbrudi, where the Dalton Highway finally reaches the flat coastal plain of Prudhoe Bay, a different threshold has been forming over the past 2 decades, and it's one that didn't exist in the same form when the oil fields were first developed. Polar bears hunt seals from sea ice, and as that ice has retreated earlier each spring and formed later each fall, more bears are spending more of the year on land. Closer to the North Slope's industrial infrastructure, and to the communities that live alongside it. Wildlife biologists with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game have documented a measurable rise in bears denning on land, rather than on sea ice in this region over recent decades, a shift tied directly to the ice, retreating farther from shore each summer than it used to. The infrastructure carrying oil away from Prudhoe Bay had to solve a threshold of its own before a single bear ever became the concern locals manage today. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline runs 800 miles south from the fields here to the port at Valdez, and across roughly 420 miles of that route, engineers building it in the mid-1970s found ground too warm and unstable to bury the pipe safely at all. Permafrost, soil that stays frozen year-round, keeps a kind of structural integrity only as long as it stays frozen. and a hot oil pipeline laid directly against it would have thawed the ground beneath its own length, causing exactly the kind of settling and slope failure that would eventually rupture the pipe itself. The solution was to lift the pipeline entirely off the ground across those stretches, mounting it on more than 70,000 elevated support frames, each cooled by a passive heat pipe filled with ammonia that draws warmth up out of the surrounding permafrost whenever the air above runs colder than the ground below, actively refrigerating the soil year-round to keep the very foundation the pipeline stands on from failing beneath it. It's one of the largest deliberate engineering interventions against permafrost anywhere on Earth, built specifically because the alternative, trusting frozen ground to stay frozen on its own, was judged too dangerous a threshold to leave unmanaged across 400 miles of pipe. For oilfield workers and residents of nearby communities like Utqiagvik and Kaktovik, this has turned into a working hazard managed with the same bureaucratic seriousness as any industrial risk. Facilities on the North Slope run bear monitoring protocols, radio warnings when a bear is spotted near a work site, and in some cases employ dedicated bear guards whose entire job is watching the horizon while crews work with their attention on a task at hand. The threshold a person crosses here is drawn into the animal itself, rather than onto any map. A predator whose historical range and behavior are both changing faster than most of the infrastructure built decades ago was designed to account for, meaning safety protocols written for one set of bear behaviors are now managing a population increasingly forced onto land during exactly the season, and around exactly the settlements humans occupy most densely. Kaktovik, a small Inupiat village on Barter Island near the eastern edge of the North Slope, has become an unlikely case study in how a community adapts to a threshold that's still actively moving. Each fall, bowhead whales harvested by the village's subsistence hunters draw polar bears onto the same beaches where residents live and work, and rather than treat every encounter as an emergency, the village has built a set of routines around it. Patrols that haze bears away from populated areas without harming them, a bone pile positioned deliberately away from town to draw bears to a predictable location, and a level of day-to-day vigilance that residents describe less as fear and more as a permanent, practiced awareness, the same way a person who lives near a busy road checks both directions without consciously deciding to. That vigilance has taken on an unexpected second life. The same bears that once drew almost no outside attention now draw wildlife tourists, specifically hoping to see them gather on the island's beaches each fall. And Kaktovik's residents, who never asked to become a viewing destination, have had to build an entirely new layer of management around visitors, who don't share the community's inherited sense of exactly how close is too close. Guides now escort tour groups with the same seriousness rangers bring to Brooks Falls, because a tourist unfamiliar with bear behavior, standing where a resident wouldn't is, functionally, a new version of the same threshold the village has managed for generations, just wearing different clothing and carrying a camera instead of a subsistence harvest. It's adaptation built in real time, against a threshold that keeps redrawing itself as the ice it depends on keeps arriving later and leaving earlier than it used to. Prudhoe Bay's polar bear threshold has a companion just up the coast, one that doesn't involve a predator at all. It involves the sun itself declining to show up. Utqiagvik, formerly known by its English name Barrow, sits at just over 71 degrees north latitude on Alaska's Arctic coast, close to 5,000 residents living in the northernmost community in the United States. Each November, the sun sets there and doesn't rise again for roughly 64 to 65 consecutive days, a stretch locals mark on the calendar the way other places mark the first snow. It isn't total blackness the entire time. Civil twilight, sunlight bending around the curve of the earth, even with the sun itself below the horizon, gives midday a dim blue-gray glow for an hour or two most of the polar night. But for the bulk of each day across more than 2 months, Utqiagvik functions in a darkness that residents elsewhere in the country never experience outside of a power outage, and the body doesn't handle it neutrally. Circadian rhythm. The internal clock that regulates sleep, mood, and hormone production evolved to run on a cycle of light and dark that assumes both will show up daily in roughly predictable amounts. Strip the light out entirely for 2 months, and that clock has nothing reliable to synchronize against. Melatonin production, the hormone that signals the body it's time to sleep, normally rises and falls on a schedule cued directly by light exposure, and in a stretch of near continuous darkness, that cue effectively stops arriving, leaving some residents producing melatonin at odd, drifting hours rather than the predictable nightly rhythm the body relies on elsewhere. Seasonal depression rates run measurably higher across northern Alaska than in the lower 48, and residents describe a specific, recognizable fatigue that settles in by December, less like ordinary tiredness, and more like a low-grade fog that doesn't lift with sleep, because sleep itself becomes harder to regulate once the usual cues for it disappear. The threshold here works less like a line crossed once and more like a slow erosion, cumulative, building across weeks, rather than announcing itself in a single dramatic moment, which in some ways makes it harder to manage than an avalanche or a flood, because there's no discrete instant where a resident can say the danger has arrived. What Utqiagvik has built in response looks almost nothing like emergency preparedness, and almost everything like deliberate. Scheduled maintenance of a community's collective mood, light therapy lamps, calibrated to mimic the wavelength and intensity of daylight, are common enough in local households and workplaces that they read less as a specialty medical device and more as standard winter furniture. Community events cluster deliberately through the darkest weeks rather than thinning out the way seasonal gatherings might elsewhere, because organizers understand that isolation compounds the darkness's effect on mood in ways that structured social contact directly counters. Inupiat families who've lived on this coast for generations frame the polar night less as an ordeal to survive and more as one half of an annual rhythm that also includes, from mid-May through early August, a season of genuine midnight sun, where the reverse happens and the sun never sets at all. Schools in the district build their calendars around this rhythm rather than fighting it, scheduling more indoor activity time and adjusting recess expectations through the darkest weeks. And workplaces increasingly treat scheduled outdoor light exposure less as an employee wellness perk and more as basic operational maintenance, the way a business elsewhere might treat regular equipment servicing. Adaptation here amounts to a full-year architecture of behavior rather than any single fix, built around a light cycle that swings harder between extremes than almost anywhere else inhabited on Earth. The sea beyond Utqiagvik's shore holds its own threshold. This one governed less by a clock than by ice that has stopped behaving the way it did for the generations of hunters who first learned to read it. Along Alaska's northwest coast, in communities like Point Hope, Wainwright, and Kotzebue, Inupiat whaling and seal hunting crews have depended for centuries on shore-fast ice, the band of sea ice anchored to the coastline, as both a hunting platform and a road out onto open water leads where whales and seals surface to breathe. Reading that ice correctly, knowing which stretches are thick enough to hold a crew in a boat, which pressure ridges signal instability underneath, which open leads are likely to refreeze safely overnight, and which will widen instead, is knowledge passed down explicitly, hunter to hunter, over generations. Because a misread has always carried the possibility of a crew drifting away on a broken floe or falling straight through into water cold enough to disable a person in minutes. That knowledge is now operating against a moving target. Sea ice across the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas has been forming later in the fall and breaking up earlier in spring than it did even a few decades ago. And the ice that does form has, in many documented seasons, grown thinner and less stable than the ice generations of hunters learned their craft on. Crews report leads opening in places and at times that don't match the patterns their elders taught them. floes breaking away from the shore-fast edge with hunters still on them, and rescue calls to the Coast Guard for stranded hunting parties becoming a more regular feature of the spring season than they used to be. The threshold a hunter crosses, walking out onto the shore-fast ice, hasn't changed in its basic shape, solid ice versus open or unstable water, but the line itself has become harder to locate using the exact methods that once located it reliably, forcing communities to layer new tools, GPS tracking, satellite ice imagery, and constant radio contact between crews, onto knowledge that used to be sufficient on its own. When a crew does end up stranded on a broken floe, rescue almost always means a Coast Guard helicopter flying out of a forward operating base, bases, often covering enormous distances across open water and shifting ice to reach a party that may have drifted well beyond their last reported position by the time a response is even launched. Crews carry emergency locator beacons now specifically because a floe carrying stranded hunters doesn't stay still while help is en route, and a rescue that used to depend entirely on other boats spotting a party by chance now depends on a chain of technology, satellite positioning, radio relays, and airborne search patterns, layered on top of the same fundamental problem hunters here have always faced: open, moving water, cold enough to disable a person within minutes, standing between a stranded crew and solid ground. What hasn't changed is why people keep going out. A single bowhead whale, successfully harvested, can provide a substantial share of a village's meat for the year, distributed communally, according to traditions that predate any outside contact with the region at all. The hunt isn't a recreational risk taken for its own sake. It's a subsistence necessity in communities where the cost of importing equivalent food by air, in places with no road connection to anywhere, can run high enough to make hunting the more practical option even before considering the cultural and nutritional value the harvest carries. Whaling captains coordinate closely with the Coast Guard and with each other before major hunts now, sharing ice condition reports gathered from multiple crews scouting different stretches of the shore-fast edge simultaneously. A collective information gathering approach that spreads the risk of a bad read across many eyes, rather than leaving any single crew to judge conditions alone. Crews go out because the alternative, not hunting, carries its own cost, and the adaptation underway on this coast right now is less about avoiding the threshold and more about relearning, in real time, exactly where a threshold that used to sit still has decided to move. Follow the coast far enough southwest and the threats stop being about land altogether. They become a question of what the water itself is willing to do to a boat. In a stretch of ocean that has earned a reputation among people who make their living on it that few other fisheries on Earth can match. The Aleutian chain arcs more than 1,000 miles from the Alaska Peninsula toward Russia, a string of volcanic islands separating the Bering Sea from the open Pacific. The strait between those two bodies of water functions almost like a nozzle, funneling weather systems that build across an enormous, largely unbroken stretch of open Pacific into a narrowing channel where storms intensify rather than dissipate. Local wind events called willywaws, sudden violent downdrafts that can accelerate from a calm sea to hurricane-force gusts in minutes with almost no warning, are common enough here that vessels operating in the region build their entire watch schedule around the assumption that conditions can change faster than a forecast can be updated. Winter in the Bering Sea regularly produces waves compared, credibly, to multi-story buildings, breaking over the decks of boats that are, by any ordinary standard, substantial ocean-going vessels 100 feet long or more, riding waves tall enough to briefly bury the wheelhouse under solid green water rather than spray. The economics that keep boats out in these conditions are specific and largely invisible to anyone who's never worked the industry. Alaska's crab and groundfish fisheries centered around ports like Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, one of the highest volume fishing ports by landed catch in the entire country, run on short, intense seasons where a boat's entire year of income can depend on a handful of days at sea. That compressed schedule creates direct pressure to fish through weather that in almost any other industry would shut operations down entirely. Federal researchers who study workplace fatality data have documented Bering Sea and Aleutian Island crab fishing as carrying one of the highest occupational death rates ever measured in the United States, with the crab fleet alone recording a fatality rate on the order of 260 deaths per 100,000 full-time workers during the years before major safety reforms, a rate that during the worst individual seasons of the 1990s climbed even higher, averaging close to 8 deaths a year across a fleet fishing seasons that sometimes lasted only a handful of days. The mechanism behind most of those deaths wasn't exotic. It was straightforward physics that crews and vessel owners had for years been incentivized to ignore. Crab pots stacked on deck for transport to the fishing grounds add enormous top-heavy weight to a boat already riding low from a full catch below. And in freezing spray, that stacked gear accumulates ice, adding still more weight exactly where a vessel can least afford it, high above the waterline, shifting its center of gravity until a wave that a properly loaded boat would ride out instead rolls the vessel over entirely. Boats capsized this way sank fast enough, often at night, often far enough from other vessels, that crews had little to no time to deploy survival suits or life rafts before the cold Bering Sea water did the rest. What changed the death toll wasn't a change in the weather. It was a change in the rules governing the loading itself. Federal researchers presented their capsizing data directly to the Coast Guard, and in 1999, the Coast Guard instituted mandatory dockside stability and safety checks, physically inspecting a vessel's pot load and stability calculations before it was allowed to leave port for the fishing grounds. The fatality rate in the fishery most associated with those capsizings dropped from an average of roughly 8 deaths a year to less than 1 within a few years of the checks taking effect. One of the clearest documented cases anywhere in American industry of a specific regulatory fix directly, measurably reducing a body count that had been treated for years as simply the cost of the work. Survival suits. Insulated one-piece coveralls designed to keep a person alive in near-freezing water for hours rather than minutes became standard required equipment aboard these vessels around the same period, and crews now drill deploying them the way an airline drills evacuation procedures. Because a suit still folded in a locker when a boat rolls does a sinking crew no good at all. The threshold in the Aleutians hasn't gotten any gentler. What changed is that crews now cross it with a stability check and a suit within arm's reach rather than a guess. And the adaptation in this case came from an agency rather than from the fishermen themselves, who had every financial incentive to keep loading the decks the old way until the data made the argument nobody wanted to make out loud. The chain's weather has punished more than fishing crews. In May of 1943, 11,000 American troops landed on Attu, the westernmost island in the chain, to retake it from the Japanese forces that had occupied it the previous year. And what should have been a short operation stretched into more than 2 weeks of combat, fought almost as much against the Aleutian climate as against an entrenched enemy. Winds on the island reached speeds compared credibly to a hurricane. Rain and fog alternated with almost no warning, and soldiers equipped with standard-issue leather boots, gear designed for conditions nothing like this chain's saturated, near-freezing ground, developed frostbite and trench foot on a scale that outpaced the physical fighting itself. Combat killed 549 Americans and wounded over 1,000 more. The cold and the terrain did worse. More than 1,800 additional troops were pulled from action by frostbite and exposure-related illness alone, meaning the Aleutian environment itself disabled more American soldiers on Attu than enemy fire managed to. Military planners drew a direct lesson from the campaign that shaped cold weather equipment standards for decades afterward, because the failure wasn't a mystery. It was inadequate footwear and inadequate preparation meeting a threshold. This chain has never once eased up on for anyone, soldier or fisherman, since long before either showed up to test it. The war's cost to the Aleutians fell heaviest, though, on people who never fired a shot in it. Following the Japanese bombing of Dutch Harbor and the occupation of Adu and Kiska in June of 1942, American authorities forcibly evacuated more than 800 Unangax residents from 9 villages across the chain, giving some communities as little as 24 hours to gather what they could carry before being loaded onto transport ships. In some cases, watching military personnel burn their own homes and churches behind them, so the structures couldn't shelter Japanese forces. The evacuees were relocated more than 1,000 miles away to a handful of hastily converted sites in southeast Alaska, a defunct cannery and an abandoned mining camp among them. Buildings with no reliable water supply, no sewage system, and in several cases no heat, electricity, or intact windows through a subarctic winter. Roughly 1 in 10 of the people relocated to these camps died there before the war's end, mostly from pneumonia and tuberculosis spreading through conditions the federal government itself had created. The village on Attu fared worse still. Its 42 residents, captured when Japanese forces occupied the island, were taken as prisoners to Japan, where 22 died of malnutrition, starvation, or tuberculosis before the survivors were freed at the war's end. The village itself had been destroyed in the fighting to retake the island, and officials never allowed the survivors to rebuild there, resettling them instead on a different island hundreds of miles away. The Aleutians' wartime threshold, in other words, wasn't only wind and cold and combat. For the people who had lived on these islands longest, it was also a government evacuation that proved, for many of them, more lethal than the invasion it was meant to protect them from. Roughly 200 miles north of the Aleutian chain, isolated in the middle of the Bering Sea with no other land visible in any direction, sit the Pribilof Islands, home to the villages of St. Paul and St. George. These are among the most remote inhabited places in the United States, reachable only by small aircraft or infrequent barge service, and blanketed by fog for something close to 200 days out of an average year, dense enough at times to ground flights for days at a stretch and leave the islands functionally sealed off from the rest of the state. The Pribilofs carry a different kind of threshold than anywhere else on this list, one built less around a single dramatic hazard and more around the compounding weight of true isolation. A medical emergency here doesn't resolve with a short ambulance ride. It depends on weather clear enough for a plane to land, which in a place fogged in roughly half the days of the year is never a given. And residents describe planning their lives around exactly that uncertainty, stocking medication further in advance than people elsewhere would think necessary, treating a minor injury with more caution than it might otherwise warrant, because the gap between a manageable problem and a serious one is out here measured largely in whether an aircraft can get through. The island's population today is overwhelmingly Unangax, descendants of Aleut people, who were relocated here by Russian fur traders in the late 18th century, specifically to hunt the massive northern fur seal colonies that breed on the Pribilofs each summer, one of the largest fur seal rookeries on Earth. That relocation was not a voluntary migration in any meaningful sense, and the isolation that makes the island so hazardous today was, for the community's ancestors, imposed rather than chosen. A detail that matters for understanding why the Unangax relationship to this remoteness carries a different history than the relationship a modern visitor or seasonal worker brings to the same fog and the same runway closures. That history left a community with generations of accumulated skill at surviving in genuine isolation, skill that shows up today less as anything dramatic and more as an ordinary, deeply practiced self-sufficiency. Extensive food stores built for a fog season nobody can predict the length of small-scale local infrastructure maintained without the expectation of quick outside help, and a community rhythm built around weather windows rather than a calendar. Because on St. Paul and St. George, the calendar has never been the thing that actually determines what a given week is going to look like. Isolation of a different kind sits southeast of the Pribilofs, on an island large enough to hold real towns, real roads, and a Coast Guard base, and dangerous for a reason that has nothing to do with distance from help. Kodiak Island is home to the largest brown bears on Earth, a subspecies grown massive on a diet built almost entirely around the salmon that return to the island's rivers and lakes in numbers few other ecosystems can match, and nowhere on the island concentrates that relationship more densely than the drainage around Karluk Lake. Wildlife biologists surveying the Karluk Lake area have counted roughly 179 individual bears within a drainage of just over 120 square miles, a concentration that ranks among the densest populations of brown bears documented anywhere on the planet and across the archipelago as a whole. Biologists estimate somewhere close to 3,500 bears sharing an island only slightly larger than the state of Connecticut, a comparison that tends to land harder with visitors than the raw bear count ever does on its own. The threshold here is straightforward in a way most of the others on this list aren't. It's a line between a landscape that can support a moderate, manageable bear presence and one where the animal outnumbers almost any other large mammal a visitor might expect to encounter, dense enough that guides operating in the area plan routes as much around known bear activity as around scenery. What makes Kodiak's bears less predictable than the popular image of an aggressive predator is that they aren't, for the overwhelming majority of encounters, hunting people at all. Conflict here usually traces back to a narrower, more specific failure: a surprised bear at close range, a sow with cubs reading a human presence as a threat to her young, or in the more preventable cases, a bear that has learned to associate a campsite or a fish camp with an easy meal, a habituation that guides and wildlife officers treat as the single most dangerous development in any bear-human relationship. Because a bear that has stopped fearing people has crossed a threshold of its own that's extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Kodiak's outfitters and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game have converged over decades on a specific set of practices built to keep that threshold from ever being crossed. Food and scented items stored in bear-resistant containers well away from sleeping areas, deliberate noise made while moving through thick brush along salmon streams to avoid surprising a feeding bear at close range, and electric fencing around remote camps that has become close to standard equipment rather than an optional precaution. Local guides describe the discipline less as fear management and more as a form of ongoing negotiation, since the island's economy depends heavily on people willing to travel specifically to see these bears, whether through sport hunting under strict permit quotas or through the growing bear viewing tourism industry centered on float plane access to salmon streams. Both activities rely on exactly the same body of accumulated behavioral knowledge. When a bear is feeding and can be safely observed from a distance, when it's stressed or defending cubs and needs space, no visitor should close. And the guides who read that distinction correctly, trip after trip, are functionally translating a threshold most visitors would never be able to judge safely on their own. The community of Kodiak, the island's main town, has grown up around this coexistence in ways visible in small daily details most residents no longer notice consciously. Garbage stored indoors or in bear-resistant bins rather than left out overnight. Dogs kept closer to homes during the fall months when bears are actively feeding ahead of winter denning. And a general cultural fluency around bear behavior that residents absorb the way children elsewhere absorb basic road safety, not from a single lesson, but from years of ordinary exposure to a hazard. The whole community has learned to read collectively, rather than leaving each individual household to work it out alone. Roughly 70 miles across Shelikof Strait from Kodiak on the Alaska Peninsula sits a place that has taken the opposite approach to the same animal, turning proximity to bears into one of the most closely managed wildlife viewing operations in the country. Katmai National Park holds an estimated bear population in the thousands, and each summer, at a set of falls on the Brooks River, dozens of them gather in a stretch of water barely wide enough for the fish attempting to leap it. drawn by a salmon run concentrated enough that bears who would normally avoid each other's company tolerate close proximity purely because the food source justifies the risk. Where Carluke Lake's threshold is about density spread across open wilderness, Brooks Falls concentrates the same underlying hazard into a few hundred yards of riverbank, managed by the Park Service, with a level of procedural discipline that looks almost like an airport security line, grafted onto a wilderness area. Visitors pass through a bear-proof electrified corridor to reach viewing platforms elevated above the water. Rangers enforce strict rules about food storage, minimum distances, and right-of-way that favor the bears absolutely, since a bear moving along its usual fishing route through a crowd of visitors is, functionally, still a bear crossing terrain it considers its own, and the park's operating philosophy treats every human presence at the falls as a temporary guest rather than an equal claimant to the space. The system works well enough that Katmai has become one of the rare places on Earth where dozens of massive brown bears and dozens of human visitors occupy the same few hundred yards of riverbank for months at a stretch with remarkably few serious incidents, a result built on decades of refined protocol rather than luck. Protocol constructed specifically around understanding exactly where the threshold between tolerable proximity and genuine danger sits, and enforced without exception, regardless of how calm a given afternoon happens to look. Part of what makes Brooks Falls work as a model is a strict hierarchy rangers enforce even among the bears themselves, deferring to whichever animal has established dominance at a given fishing spot and adjusting human viewing access accordingly, rather than treating all bear activity as interchangeable. A bear the rangers know by sight and behavioral history, tracked across seasons, gets a different management response than an unfamiliar animal showing unpredictable behavior, and that individualized tracking, unusual for a wildlife management program of this scale, is part of what has let so many bears and so many visitors share such a narrow stretch of river. Without the frequency of serious incident, the numbers alone might otherwise predict. That same individual tracking has turned into an unlikely piece of public outreach. Park staff photograph and catalog specific bears returning to the falls year after year, documenting each one's weight gain through the summer salmon run in a way precise enough that the park now runs an annual public competition inviting people worldwide to vote on which bear has bulked up most impressively ahead of winter denning, an event that draws millions of participants and has done more to popularize Katmai's bear population, and by extension the whole logic behind the park's safety protocols, than any conventional wildlife education campaign likely could have. Visitors who show up having followed a specific named bear online for months arrive already primed to respect the distance rules the park enforces, because they've spent a season learning to read that individual animal's behavior from a live stream long before they ever stood on a platform above the actual river. The contrast between Kodiak and Katmai says something worth sitting with about how a single animal can define two entirely different kinds of threshold, depending on the terrain around it. On Kodiak, the danger is diffuse, spread across open country where a bear can appear from any direction with no infrastructure managing the encounter at all, and the burden of avoiding conflict falls almost entirely on individual judgment, timing, and noise discipline. At Brooks Falls, the danger is concentrated into a small, intensely managed space, and the burden shifts instead onto institutional design, elevated platforms, controlled corridors, ranger enforcement, built specifically to let people stand closer to more bears at once than would ever be survivable without that structure in place. Neither approach eliminates the underlying animal. Each one adapts the humans around it to a threshold that, left unmanaged, would behave identically in both places. Between Kodiak and the mainland, where the Copper River fans out into the Gulf of Alaska across one of the largest contiguous wetlands on the continent's Pacific coast, a different kind of water threshold takes over, One built less around temperature or tide, and more around a current that behaves less like a river mouth and more like a machine actively working against anyone trying to cross it. The Copper River Delta drains glacial meltwater across a maze of braided channels, sandbars, and mudflats that shift from season to season and sometimes from week to week, carrying enormous volumes of silt-laden water into the Gulf with a force that surprises people who assume a river delta means calm, shallow water spreading gently toward the sea. It doesn't work that way here. Currents in the delta's channels can run fast enough to overturn a small boat or sweep a waiting person off their feet within seconds, and the same glacial silt that makes Turnagain Arms Flats treacherous underfoot does something almost as dangerous in the water itself, clouding visibility to the point that a channel that looks a foot deep can drop to 6 feet without any visual warning, and hiding submerged debris, sweepers, and sudden drop-offs that a boat operator has no way to see coming until the hull is already committed to the mistake. The Delta is also home to one of Alaska's most economically important commercial fisheries, centered on the town of Cordova, where gill netters chase sockeye and coho salmon runs prized enough to command some of the highest per-pound prices of any wild salmon fishery in the state. That economic pressure puts working boats into these channels in conditions many recreational operators would never attempt, often at the exact tidal stages when current speed peaks, because the fish move with the tide, and a fisherman who waits for calmer water simply isn't fishing. Coast Guard and local search and rescue records for the Delta area show a recurring pattern behind the fatalities that do occur here: capsizings and swampings in fast water, often compounded by cold water immersion that disables a person within minutes even when the boat itself stays upright, and drownings among waders and small boat operators caught by a channel that shifted its depth and course since the last time they'd crossed it. Cordova's fishing families have built an entire working vocabulary around reading this delta that outsiders rarely appreciate on a first visit. Which channels are reliably deep enough for a loaded boat at a given tide stage, which sandbars migrate fastest and need to be rescouted each season, which weather combinations turn an ordinary outgoing tide into something lethal for a boat riding low with a full net. None of that knowledge is written down in a single authoritative place. It's passed from one generation of fishing families to the next, refined boat trip by boat trip, because the delta itself refuses to hold still long enough for a chart to stay accurate for more than a season or two. And the fishermen who've worked these waters longest are, functionally, the only reliably updated map the channel actually has. The delta's ecological value adds a layer most visitors never connect to the navigational danger itself. This wetland complex ranks among the most critical staging grounds on the entire Pacific Flyway, hosting millions of migrating shorebirds each spring in numbers few other single sites in North America can match, and the same braided, shifting channels that make the water so hard to read for a boat operator are exactly the habitat structure that makes the delta so valuable to the birds passing through it. The hazard and the ecological significance aren't separate facts sitting side by side. They're the same geography, read two different ways depending on whether the observer is standing in a boat or watching through binoculars from the bank. Cordova itself has no road connection to the rest of Alaska's highway system, reachable only by air or by ferry across water that carries its own share of the delta's unpredictability. And that isolation shapes the town's relationship to its fishery in a way that mirrors the Pribilofs more than it resembles a typical American fishing port. A bad ice year on the ferry route or a grounded flight during a bad weather stretch can mean a genuine supply gap for a community that depends on both regular freight and a functioning fishery for its economic survival, which is part of why Cordova's gill netters treat the Copper River season with an urgency that looks, from outside, almost reckless. What's actually driving it is a community that understands precisely how narrow its own margins are, on the water and off it, and has built its entire working calendar around making the most of a short, dangerous season rather than waiting out a safety margin the town's economy simply cannot afford to wait for. West along the coast, in the network of fjords and channels collectively known as Prince William Sound, the threshold shifts from current to temperature, and it's a threshold that kills with a speed most people underestimate badly. Water in the Sound rarely climbs above the mid-40s even in summer, cold enough that unexpected immersion triggers what physiologists call cold shock response, an involuntary gasp reflex, a spike in heart rate and blood pressure, and a rapid loss of muscle coordination in the arms and legs that can leave even a strong swimmer unable to perform the basic strokes needed to reach a nearby boat or shore. Cold shock alone has drowned people within the first minute of immersion, well before hypothermia itself. The slower cooling of the body's core has had time to become the primary threat. Kayakers, sport fishermen, and tour operators work these waters constantly. Drawn by scenery, wildlife, and calving tidewater glaciers that draw more visitors to Prince William Sound's coastline than almost anywhere else in the state. Is your state Rekel Almon? And the mismatch between how sheltered these fjords look and how lethal an accidental capsize can be is exactly what search and rescue teams here describe as their most persistent challenge. A calm, glassy inlet, ringed by mountains, photographs like the safest water imaginable. It carries almost none of the visual cues, whitecaps, obvious current, that would warn an inexperienced paddler about the actual risk waiting a few degrees below the surface. Guides who operate commercially in the Sound treat immersion suits and dry suits as non-negotiable equipment rather than optional gear, not because the water looks dangerous, but specifically because it doesn't. And the entire local safety culture has been built around correcting for a visual mismatch between how the Sound appears and what it actually does to an unprotected body within the first 90 seconds of a fall overboard. New guides in the area often describe the same specific moment of recalibration early in their training. The first time an instructor has them briefly submerge a bare hand in the actual water on a calm, sunny day, precisely so the shock of it registers as a physical memory rather than an abstract number on a safety briefing slide. That mismatch runs even deeper than temperature alone. Prince William Sound's shoreline is riddled with tidewater glaciers that periodically calve enormous slabs of ice into the water, sometimes generating waves large enough to swamp a small boat anchored what had seemed like a comfortably safe distance away. And experienced boat operators here treat any glacier face as capable of calving without warning, regardless of how still the ice appears in the moment. The Sound's history includes exactly this kind of sudden violence on a scale most visitors never anticipate. The Sound also carries a more recent kind of history that shapes how seriously the region now treats maritime risk. The 1989 grounding of an oil tanker on Bligh Reef and the spill that followed reshaped both the regulatory environment and the local culture around operating safely in these waters, prompting escort tug requirements for loaded tankers transiting the Sound and a level of ongoing environmental monitoring most other stretches of Alaska coastline don't carry. A quarter century before that spill, Prince William Sound produced the single most violent geological event in the region's recorded history, and the scar it left explains why so much of the Sound's coastline sits so close to catastrophic risk, even on a day with no storm anywhere in sight. On the evening of March 27, 1964, an earthquake measuring magnitude 9.2, the second largest ever recorded anywhere on Earth, ruptured along a fault beneath the Sound itself. The shaking alone did damage, but the deaths that followed came overwhelmingly from what the quake triggered next: underwater landslides that displaced enormous volumes of water within seconds, sending tsunamis crashing into shoreline communities before most residents had any real chance to react. The Alutiiq village of Chenega, built on a slope directly above the fault's rupture, was struck by a wave within minutes of the first shaking, killing 23 of the village's 76 residents, close to a third of everyone who lived there. Valdez, sighted at the time on unstable delta ground at the head of a fjord, watched its own waterfront collapse directly into the sea as the shaking loosened the ground beneath the docks, a failure that helped generate a wave recorded at Shoup Bay, nearby in Valdez Inlet, reaching a height of 67 meters, and the town lost 31 residents that evening, more than any other single community affected statewide. Of the roughly 106 deaths the tsunamis caused across Alaska that night, the overwhelming majority came from these underwater landslide waves rather than from the shaking itself, striking too fast, in several cases, for warning to reach the people standing closest to the water. Valdez never rebuilt on its original ground. Engineers who studied the collapse concluded the delta soil the old town site sat on was inherently unstable under strong shaking, prone to a failure called soil liquefaction that turns saturated ground temporarily fluid under intense vibration, and the entire community relocated 4 miles away to bedrock considered safe from a repeat failure. An adaptation on a scale almost nothing else on this list required. Not a new protocol or a piece of rescue equipment, but an entire town accepting that the ground it had built on could no longer be trusted, and moving. That's the threshold Prince William Sound carries beneath its calmer, more frequent hazards of cold water and calving ice. A fault capable, on rare but real occasions, of doing to an entire shoreline what a single wave did to Lituya Bay in the exact same general region, 10 years earlier, on a smaller and more contained scale. What keeps people coming anyway is the same pull that draws visitors and workers to nearly every location on this list, a landscape unlike anywhere else, worth the specific, well-understood risk it carries, provided the risk is respected rather than assumed away by how peaceful the surface happens to look on any given afternoon. Not every threshold on this list involves open country. Some sit less than a mile from a parking lot, inside a landscape that markets itself, quite reasonably, as one of the most accessible glaciers in the state. The Mendenhall Glacier flows down out of the Juneau ice field to within a short walk of Alaska's capital city, popular enough that a paved trail and a visitor center bring tens of thousands of tourists within sight of its face every summer. Beneath that same ice, meltwater carves an entirely different landscape each season. Tunnels and caverns, hollowed into the glacier's underside, some tall enough to walk through upright, their walls glowing an almost impossible shade of blue, where compressed ice filters sunlight down to its bluest wavelengths. Photographs of these caves circulate constantly online, and the appeal is obvious and largely legitimate. Few natural structures on Earth look quite like the inside of an actively melting glacier. What the photographs don't show is that the caves are, structurally, disaster sites in slow motion. Glaciers move constantly and melt unevenly, and the caverns forming inside this one are themselves a symptom of that instability, carved by exactly the same meltwater processes that are actively weakening the ice roof overhead. Park rangers and local search and rescue volunteers describe the caves as fundamentally unpredictable on a timescale that makes any individual visit a gamble. A ceiling that held firm all week can calve without warning the moment temperatures rise a few degrees, or when a chunk of ice upstream shifts the load distribution across the whole formation. Rescuers responding to incidents here have recovered hikers killed not by the widely publicized risk of a ceiling collapse alone, but by a related and less obvious hazard, meltwater channels running beneath the ice that behave like moving machinery rather than still water. In one documented case, someone sa Ultramang documented Kings, a person working near the glacier's surface fell into a narrow vertical shaft where meltwater plunges directly down through the ice, a formation glaciologists call a moulin, and the force of the moving water made rescue too dangerous to attempt before hypothermia, and the physical violence of the current did the rest. The threshold at Mendenhall is deceptively narrow. It runs directly along the boundary between glacier ice that looks, from the outside, like a stable geological feature, and the same ice functioning mechanically as a constantly shifting structure actively being undermined by its own meltwater. Local guides who lead permitted tours into the safer, monitored sections of the ice make a point of explaining this distinction to every group before a single step is taken onto the glacier. Nothing about a glacier's surface tells a visitor which parts are solid bedrock equivalent ice and which parts are a thin shell over an active void. The trail signage, the fencing around known unstable zones, and the seasonal closures that shut down specific caves entirely, once melt, season accelerates all exist. Because the visual cues a person would normally trust, firm-looking ice, a ceiling that appears solid, tell a visitor almost nothing reliable about what's actually happening structurally a few feet above their head. The glacier's retreat has made this threshold move even faster than the seasonal melt cycle alone would explain. Mendenhall has receded significantly over the past several decades, a pace documented in repeat photography going back generations, and each year of retreat changes which caves exist at all, where the safest viewing points sit relative to the current ice front, and how far a visitor now has to hike simply to reach ice that used to be a short walk from the parking area. The lake that has formed at the glacier's retreating face didn't exist in anything like its current size within living memory of Juneau's older residents, and it continues to widen as the ice keeps pulling back from it, meaning the entire approach hikers use to reach the glacier has had to be rerouted more than once, as the old trail simply stopped leading anywhere near the ice it was built to reach. Guides working the glacier today are, in a very literal sense, mapping terrain that didn't exist in this configuration even a handful of seasons ago, and won't exist in the same configuration a handful of seasons from now. South of Anchorage, along the same Seward Highway corridor that runs past Turnagain Arms mudflats, a different mountain hazard claims lives with a regularity that local avalanche forecasters track season by season rather than incident by incident. Turnagain Pass has become one of the state's most popular backcountry snowmobiling and skiing destinations, prized for deep, reliable snowpack within an easy drive of Anchorage's population base, and that exact combination, heavy snow loading onto steep terrain within reach of tens of thousands of recreational users, has made it one of the most consistently avalanche-fatal corridors in the country. The physics driving avalanche risk here echo the same conditions that killed dozens of stampeders on the Chilkoot Trail more than a century earlier, playing out now against recreational skiers and snow machiners rather than gold rush prospectors. Alaska's coastal mountain snowpack tends to build in distinct layers through the winter, and when a weak layer, often formed by a period of clear, cold weather that lets surface snow crystals grow into a loose, poorly bonded structure, gets buried under a heavier subsequent snowfall. The buried layer can persist as a hidden fault line for weeks, capable of failing suddenly under the added weight of a single skier or snow machine crossing exactly the wrong slope at exactly the wrong moment. The Chugach National Forest Avalanche Center issues daily forecasts through the winter season specifically because that failure point is invisible from the surface. A slope can look identical to a dozen others a rider has already crossed safely that same day. And the difference between safe and fatal often comes down to a weak layer sitting a few feet beneath snow that looks, feels, and rides exactly the same on top. What makes Turnagain Pass distinct from Wrangell St. Elias's hidden crevasses, though the underlying shape of the threshold, invisible instability beneath a deceptively uniform surface, is nearly identical, is the sheer volume of people crossing it on any given weekend. This is a roadside recreation area, rather than remote backcountry reached by bush plane, and the accessibility that makes it so popular is the same accessibility that puts far more people onto unstable terrain on a busy Saturday than almost anywhere else avalanche danger exists in the state. Local riders who've spent years in this terrain describe a specific, hard-earned discipline that mirrors what climbers on Denali eventually learn about turnaround times, checking the day's avalanche forecast before ever loading a sled onto a trailer, carrying beacon, probe, and shovel as a baseline requirement rather than optional gear, and treating any slope steeper than about 30 degrees, the angle range where most slab avalanches release, with a caution that owes nothing to how the snow happened to look that particular morning. Modern snowmobiles have made this threshold harder to manage rather than easier, in a way that mirrors how tourism has reshaped Kaktovic's polar bear encounters. Machines built in the past couple of decades can climb steeper, deeper slopes than older sleds ever could, opening terrain to recreational riders that would have been functionally inaccessible a generation ago, and that expanded reach has put more riders onto exactly the high-angle slopes where avalanche danger concentrates. The sport's own technological progress, in other words, has pushed its participants closer to the threshold rather than farther from it, a pattern that shows up often enough across this list to be worth naming on its own. Better equipment rarely makes a hazard safer by itself. It just changes who's able to reach it, and how far past the old boundary they're now capable of going before the boundary reasserts itself. The Forecast Center's daily bulletin exists because the alternative, judging each slope purely by its surface appearance, is close to the exact mistake that has killed backcountry travelers here in nearly every documented fatal avalanche the corridor has recorded. Snowmobile clubs based out of Anchorage and the Kenai Peninsula now build informal safety culture directly into group riding norms, spacing riders one at a time across suspect slopes rather than grouping together, designating a single spotter to watch from a safe vantage point during any risky crossing, and treating a rider who skips the morning avalanche report the way a dive group might treat a diver who skipped checking their air gauge. Not as an individual choice, but as a risk the whole group now has to account for. Every place on this list so far has had, at minimum, a road, a village, a fishing port, or a well-worn trail connecting it to the rest of the state. The last threshold doesn't. It requires crossing into a landscape that ranks among the least visited pieces of ground the National Park Service manages anywhere in the country. And the reason so few people ever reach it says as much about this threshold as anything that happens once a visitor arrives. Aniakchak sits on the Alaska Peninsula, a national monument and preserve built around a volcanic caldera roughly 6 miles across, formed when the mountain that once stood there collapsed into itself following a massive eruption thousands of years ago. Inside that caldera, unlike the barren moon-like calderas found at many other volcanic sites, an entire miniature ecosystem has established itself. A crater lake, hot springs, a river called the Aniakchak that carves directly through the caldera's rim in a formation known as the Gates, and lush vegetation that thrives in ground, still warmed in places by residual volcanic heat. Photographs of the interior look almost implausibly green against the surrounding gray volcanic terrain, a landscape that appears, from the rim, more like a hidden garden than an active geologic hazard. Sockeye salmon actually run up the river and through the Gates each year to spawn in the crater's own lake, a migration route steep and turbulent enough that biologists studying it consider the population's ability to reach the lake at all a small ecological marvel in its own right. What keeps Aniakchak nearly empty has less to do with distance, the way it kept the Pribilovs isolated, and everything to do with the caldera's own weather, which local pilots who've flown the region for decades describe as some of the most violently unpredictable air in the state. The bowl-shaped topography of the crater generates its own localized wind systems, funneling gusts through the narrow gap of the Gates with enough force to make small plane approaches dangerous, even under conditions that would be entirely unremarkable a few miles away. Weather here can shift from a viable landing window to an impossible one within the time it takes a pilot to circle for a final approach. And because the monument has no roads, no maintained trail system, and essentially no infrastructure of any kind, a small aircraft is functionally the only realistic way in or out for the handful of visitors who attempt it each year. a number the Park Service itself has recorded in some seasons. In the low dozens rather than anything approaching the traffic almost any other unit in the National Park System sees. That combination, extreme structural remoteness paired with dangerous localized weather, makes Aniakchak's threshold less about a single crossing and more about the entire commitment a visit requires before a person ever sets foot in the caldera. There's no ranger station inside the monument. There's no cell coverage. A visitor who breaks an ankle on the caldera floor, or who gets weathered in past their planned pickup date, is looking at a self-rescue situation, or an extended wait for conditions to improve enough for an aircraft to reach them, with none of the infrastructure that even Wrangell St. Elias's remote glaciers can occasionally offer, through fixed-wing charter operators who fly the region more regularly. Park rangers who do work in the monument describe preparation here less as a checklist and more as a mindset. Every trip planned with the explicit assumption that the return flight might be delayed by days, food and shelter carried accordingly, and a level of self-sufficiency built into the trip from the outset rather than treated as a backup plan. The handful of people who do make the journey. Backcountry paddlers running the Aniakchak River from the Crater Lake out through the gates to the Pacific coast, volcanologists studying one of the more accessible calderas of its kind anywhere on Earth, and a small number of visitors drawn specifically by the appeal of standing somewhere this few other people ever have, treat the isolation less as an obstacle to route around and more as the entire point of the trip. Guides who've led the rare commercial descents of the Aniakchak River describe an unusual quality to the landscape's silence, an absence of any of the ordinary background evidence of other people, aircraft noise, distant boats, cleared trails that most wilderness areas in Alaska still carry in some form. Here, that evidence simply isn't present because so few people have ever crossed the threshold required to reach it, and the caldera's own weather has made sure that number stays small. The volcano itself hasn't been dormant on a human timescale in the way its lush interior might suggest to a visitor unfamiliar with its history. The caldera visible today formed roughly 3,400 years ago in an eruption violent enough that pyroclastic flows, fast-moving currents of superheated gas and volcanic debris, traveled more than 50 kilometers in multiple directions, reaching both the Bering Sea coast to the north and the Pacific coast to the south from a single eruptive event. That original collapse is the only reason the green, spring-fed landscape a modern paddler now floats through exists at all. Aniakchak's only confirmed eruption within recorded history came far more recently, a 6-week eruption beginning on May 1, 1931, violent enough to dust a wide swath of southwest Alaska in gritty ash, and produce new explosion pits with lava still visibly moving at the bottom when a Jesuit priest and volcanologist flew over to observe it in progress that June. The caldera a modern paddler floats through remains an active volcanic feature, not a static geological museum piece, one that has demonstrated within living memory that it can still reshape itself violently, which is part of why the National Park Service manages the monument with a light institutional footprint rather than the visitor infrastructure most other units eventually build. There's simply less here to protect people from themselves with, and the agency has made a considered decision to let that remain true rather than engineer away the isolation that defines the place. 20 places, 20 distinct lines crossed, and none of them share a single, tidy cause. A mudflat's danger has nothing physically in common with a summit storm or a whaling crew's shore-fast ice. But step back far enough from any individual crossing, and the same handful of underlying shapes keep recurring, just wearing different terrain each time. Some thresholds here are physiological, built into the direct limits of a human body. The cold that starts damaging exposed skin within minutes at Prospect Creek's extremes, the thinning oxygen above 17,000 feet on Denali that degrades judgment at the precise moment judgment matters most. The cold shock reflex in Prince William Sound's water that can drown a strong swimmer before hypothermia ever gets the chance to. Others are temporal, danger tied not to a place at all, but to a specific window in time. The exact weeks each spring when the Chilkoot snowpack turns unstable. The narrowing days each fall when Yukon River ice is neither reliably frozen nor safely open. The 60-some days each winter when Utqiagvik's sun simply doesn't participate. A third category is spatial. Isolation itself functioning as the hazard independent of any specific mechanism. The Pribilofs sealed by fog. Aniakchak sealed by its own violent local weather. The Dalton Highway and Wrangell-St. Elias both defined less by any single danger than by how far a person has to travel before reaching one. A fourth is ecological. A living animal whose behavior is the threshold. At Kodiak, at Katmai, on the beaches near Kaktovik, each site managing the same underlying species through a different structural solution built around local terrain and local economics. And a fifth is structural, ground, or ice that behaves like solid terrain until weight or water reveals it isn't. At Turnagain Arm, inside Mendenhall's caves, under Wrangell St. Elias's snow bridges, on Turnagain Pass's buried weak layers. What makes this list something other than a random tour of scary geography, a highlight reel of frightening scenery strung together for its own sake, is that these categories don't actually stay separated the way a tidy taxonomy would suggest. They interlock. And the interlocking is often the most consequential part of the whole picture. Sea ice arriving later each fall and retreating earlier each spring reaches well beyond being a single, contained fact about Arctic climate. It's simultaneously the reason Yukon River crossings have grown less predictable, the reason Chukchi sea hunting crews are relearning ice they thought they already understood, and the reason polar bears are spending more of the year on land near Prudhoe Bay and Kaktovik than the historical baseline ever anticipated. One physical shift, less sea ice holding its old schedule, threads through three entries on this list that look, on the surface, like they have nothing to do with each other. From a village trail committee testing river ice thickness by hand, to a Kaktovik patrol hazing a bear off a beach, to a whaling captain radioing ice reports, to a crew scouting a different stretch of the same shore-fast edge. The same is true of the coastal mountain snowpack that builds the same kind of hidden weak layer, whether it's burying gold rush stampeders on the Chilkoot in 1898, or threatening snowmobilers on Turnagain Pass more than a century later. A viewer who came looking for 20 unrelated horror stories should be leaving instead with a smaller number of underlying mechanisms, repeating themselves across a very large state in whatever local costume the terrain happens to be wearing that particular season. The same logic runs through the geology as cleanly as it runs through the climate. The Fairweather Fault that generated Lituya Bay's wave and the subduction zone that ruptured beneath Prince William Sound in 1964 are both expressions of the same underlying tectonic reality. The Pacific Plate grinding against North America along a boundary that happens to run directly through the most scenic, most heavily fished, and most heavily visited stretch of Alaska's coastline. That same collision is what lifts Denali and the Wrangell Range skyward in the first place, feeding the glaciers that carve Wrangell St. Elias's hidden crevasses and calve into Prince William Sound's cold water. A visitor standing on any one of these 20 thresholds is rarely looking at an isolated hazard. More often, they're looking at one local symptom of a small number of enormous, ongoing physical processes that never stopped operating just because a person happened to be standing nearby to notice one of their edges. There's a second, quieter pattern underneath the first one, and it says considerably more about the people living in these places than it does about the geology or the weather itself. Almost none of the adaptation described across these 20 places came from removing the danger. Nobody drained Turnagain Arm. Nobody flattened Denali's summit ridge or towed the Fairweather Fault somewhere quieter. Nobody can order the Bering Sea to stop generating willowaws, or convince a glacier to stop calving because a kayak happens to be nearby. The hazard? in every single case on this list, is still exactly as physically capable of killing someone today as it was the first time it did. What changed, over and over, wasn't the threat. It was the relationship between the people living near it and the specific, accumulated knowledge of exactly where its edge sits. Anchorage firefighters didn't make the mudflats solid, they built a rescue technique matched to how the silt actually behaves. Denali's Rangers didn't make the upper mountain calmer. They built a permit and radio system that tells them, within hours, how many people a sudden storm has put at risk. Village trail committees didn't make river ice permanently safe. They built a live, continuously updated network of local observation that replaces a single fixed measurement with dozens of current ones. Kaktovik didn't relocate its polar bears. It built a set of daily habits precise enough to let a community and a predator share the same beach for one intense season every year. In every case, survival came from a sharper, more current map of the threshold, not from erasing the threshold itself. And that map is rarely written down anywhere permanent. It lives in trail committees, in guide services, in a firefighter's training, in a whaling captain's radio call to the next crew over, in a state avalanche center's daily bulletin, updated again tomorrow, because today's answer will already be slightly wrong by then. That's also, in the end, the honest answer to the question of why people keep choosing to stand near these lines at all, generation after generation, rather than simply staying away. A Copper River gill netter doesn't fish a dangerous channel because the danger appeals to them. They fish it because a specific run of salmon, priced the way it's priced, only shows up in that channel, on that tide, for a few weeks a year, and waiting for calmer water means missing the season entirely. A whaling crew doesn't cross thinning shore-fast ice for the thrill of it. A single successful harvest feeds a community through a winter that has no cheaper alternative. A Kodiak guide doesn't walk clients past salmon streams thick with the largest bears on Earth because the risk is the product being sold. The bears are, and the risk is simply the cost of access to something the rest of the world has almost nowhere else. Strip away the specific economics and culture behind each of these 20 places, and the same underlying logic holds across everyone. The thing on the far side of the threshold, gold, salmon, oil, a whale, a summit, a landscape unlike anywhere else on the planet, has always been worth more to the people who live and work here than the statistical risk of the crossing itself, provided that crossing is made with real, current knowledge rather than a guess. None of this makes the 20 places on this list interchangeable with each other, and that distinction matters as much as anything else here. A wave in Lituya Bay, a storm on Denali's Summit Ridge, and dozens of Unangak's deaths in wartime relocation camps aren't different flavors of one generic Alaska danger. They're separate failures with separate causes, separate victims, and separate lessons, and collapsing them into a single undifferentiated idea of a dangerous state would erase exactly the kind of specific, hard-won local knowledge this whole list has been trying to surface. The value in laying 20 of these side by side owes nothing to proving Alaska is uniformly hazardous, and everything to showing how many distinct mechanisms this one piece of geography contains and how differently each community affected has had to respond, using tools built specifically for the threshold in front of them rather than a generic solution imported from somewhere else. Look at the 20 of these together, and a state starts to come into focus that doesn't much resemble the postcard version most visitors arrive expecting. Alaska isn't dangerous in the flat, generic sense that phrase usually implies, one uniform wilderness threat repeated with different scenery. It's dangerous the way an enormous, geologically young landscape is dangerous. Unevenly, specifically, each hazard shaped by its own particular physics, and each community response shaped just as specifically in return. The tectonic plates driving Lituya Bay's fault are the same forces still actively building the mountains climbers die on above Denali's high camp. The retreating ice reshaping Mendenhall's caves runs on the same broad climatic trend, rewriting the Yukon's freeze dates and the Chukchi's hunting leads. Nothing on this list is really separate from anything else on it. It's one enormous, still moving system, observed here through 20 of its sharpest edges, in a place where the rules are still being written in real time by the people who have the most at stake in getting them right, because nobody else is going to write those rules for them, and no one ever has. That's the final image worth carrying away from all 20 of these more than any single number or any single name. Not a list of things to fear, and not a checklist of places to avoid. A map, still actively being redrawn by the people who live closest to its sharpest edges, updated a little more precisely with every hard season that tests it. Of these 20 thresholds, which one would you want its own full hour? The mud flats, the avalanche slope, the ice road that isn't reliably frozen anymore? Drop the number in the comments, because that's what actually decides which edge gets mapped next. A like tells me the threshold framing actually landed better than a simple danger list would have, and subscribing keeps you here for whichever line this state redraws next.